Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today as we study the entire Talmud. But first, today is Chaf Ches Sivan, the 28th of Sivan. It's also June 8th. Does that sound right? I believe it is. And we're studying the entire Talmud one page at a time. Presently studying Meseches Shabbos, chapter 5, page Nun Hey Amud Aleph. That's 55a. If you're following the Chabad calendar of events, today is the date that the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak of Lubavitch, arrived or escaped essentially the Holocaust and arrived to the United States. It was on this day that he declared America is nit anderish, that although his friends who cared for him, and they knew Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, as a fighter, he came into his leadership in the height of developing communism and its oppression from Jewish observance, and he struggled. He was arrested, almost put to death, beaten, and thanks to a lot of efforts in America, lobbying efforts, he was saved. This is in 1928. He then has to escape Russia, and he ends up, after a little bit of wandering in Poland, where he builds up or rebuilds the Lubavitch institutions in Poland while fundraising and providing for the Jewish underground in Russia. And then, of course, Hitler, Yamach Shemoy, comes to power. And again, miraculously, because most who lived in Poland at the time were not privileged to escape, but some Chabad people that were connected to the State Department, actually Boston Chabadniks, or they weren't, I don't know if they were Chabadniks, but their parents were Chabadniks and were close to the Rebbe. They lobby the State Department, and at that time, America and Germany were still not at war, and Germany was trying to keep America out of the war, and America, I guess, was getting whatever concessions it could. And one of the things that they ended up doing is saving the previous Rebbe. And a long story short, eventually he makes it to America on this Hebrew date. And
via Portugal.
Via Portugal, yes. Oh, no, that was the Rebbe. The Rebbe went through Portugal. I don't know if the previous Rebbe arrives to America. I don't know the exact route.
Right.
And his followers meet someone who they'd known as a very strong, physically strong person, and they see what a toll the abuse that he received in Russia, and then the painful years of the rise of Hitler, and he's physically a shadow of his original health. And the people who cared for him, who saved him, say, Rebbe, now you're going to take a break. They wanted to send him off, of all places, to Lakewood, New Jersey, which then wasn't what Lakewood is today. Then Lakewood was a country kind of place where people would go to rest up. And I believe there was maybe a kosher hotel, and they wanted to send the Rebbe there. I think the Rebbe may have gone there, but he said, no, America is nit anderish, and if we can't find Jewish institutions and yeshivas and the like, we have to make them. And many of his followers who cared for him said, Rebbe, you got to take it, you got to take a break, you got to take it easy, and he refused to do so. And so that began what can be described as day one of the Chabad outreach in the United States. And of course, the rest is history. Baruch Hashem, other Jews as well, thank God, survived the war and came to America. And there's a whole host of different Jewish communities that were constructed. But certainly the previous Rebbe on this day, we can give a little credit to the fact that his work and his successors' work, certainly, the Lubavitch Rebbe certainly have had a big impact on the world Jewry, and certainly in America. And so it's a special day in the Chabad calendar, and anyone that appreciates the previous Rebbe's contribution. While we're at it, another 10 seconds just to point out, this Sunday or Saturday night will be Gimel Tammuz, the yard site of the Rebbe. So that's another important Chabad day. And as I noted, I won't be here because I'll be in the air. But now let's get started with our learning. We're back to Masechah Shabbos, and we referenced a story yesterday from our Mishnah about how the great Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was one of the wealthiest men and the greatest scholars, and a miyuchas, right? He had a very chashuv lineage, and he's recorded in the Mishnah as having allowed one of his cows to go out in a manner that the rabbis did not permit. And the Gemara asked that question. The Gemara essentially says, the whole story doesn't make sense. Elazar ben Azariah didn't have one para. He had 12,000 tithe cows, which means that he has at least 120,000 new a year, which means that he has quite a flock, or not a flock, a herd, I think we'd say. Alan, correct me if I'm wrong. And so the Gemara says, yeah, you're right. It was his neighbors, and he didn't protest. And because he didn't protest, and he should have spoken up, and therefore he's accused or alleged to have committed such a crime, because a person, certainly of his stature, if he sees something wrong and he's silent, that could be, and again, this gets back to our old conversation about what does silence mean. If you don't say anything, can you infer from that silence consent, agreeing or not? But suffice it to say, the Gemara is critical, not the Gemara, the Mishnah is critical of his silence. Not to say that he sinned, God forbid, but he could have been more vocal, and that is the Mishnah. This is, of course, going to trigger a somewhat lengthy Agadic discussion about Tochacha, admonishment, when to speak up, when not to speak up. And of course, this is an interesting topic, a complex topic. I'm not going to claim that we're going to cover every angle and facet of the discussion, but the Gemara certainly is going to give us quite an interesting ride today. And as I said before we hit record, we're going to have fun. So thank you for being here. We'll dedicate today's learning for those that are in need of refuah, and we'll share the screen, hopefully the right screen. I think it is. Here we go. Just to recap yesterday's one line. Tana, Loi, Shaloi Haisa, the cow was not Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's, Ela Shal Shchentoi Haisa, it belonged to his neighbor, Mitoich Shaloi Micha Ba, because he failed to protest, Nikras Al Shemai, he is therefore, it's therefore associated to him. The story is associated to him. Why didn't he protest? Why didn't he protest? Did he disagree with the Chachamim? The Chachamim said a para can't go out with such a band on its horns. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah knew that, but he didn't protest. So I guess popped open the Ben Yoyada, and he says, why didn't he protest? He says it's possible that although Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah didn't explicitly disagree with his friends, when he saw his neighbor going out like that, he didn't protest. So people inferred that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah really felt that it was acceptable. He would never ask him to do so, but he must have not had the same aversion and belief, because otherwise he would have spoken up. Dr. Hammer, you're muted. Please unmute yourself so we can hear you. Go ahead, doctor.
It's a minor issue, but it appears that his neighbor was a female, and I think maybe that had something to do with it.
Possibly. What do you think? You don't want to hurt her?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure of the interactions between males and females in those days. Second of all, it appears perhaps that there was no male living in that house, and maybe he felt that it would be not taken, depending on how it was presented, appropriately in many ways, but also before women's lip telling her what you don't know what you're doing here, I know what I'm doing, or talking to a woman who's living alone in the house, any of those issues. It's just interesting.
Very interesting that you bring that up.
Right.
I'm not certain. That's very interesting. It's definitely something worth considering, what exactly the dynamics may have been. There are actually achronim, and I don't recall exactly who discuss if it's possible that women might have less of a prohibition about regulating their animals on Shabbos, because maybe, and this is not ultimately this is not the halacha, but there is such a discussion that maybe the laws of Shabbos are mitzvahs aseh shazman grama, perhaps it's related to time. So although that's not ultimately the psak din, it is interesting that you bring up her gender. I just want to point out that the Ben Yoyada says from here it can be inferred that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was of the opinion that it would be permissible. He's not going to explicitly contradict the majority, but he saw his neighbor walking around and it didn't inspire the kind of aversion or immediate, awareness that, oh, that's a Shabbos prohibition, I got to say something. No, in his mind, it was acceptable. He wouldn't do it, but he didn't, it wasn't so bad that he was going to protest about it. But ultimately, that's what the Ben Yoyada explains, if I understand correctly. And ultimately, the Mishnah is somewhat critical of that decision. Rebero, yes.
Even though I didn't hear the story, I can comment anyway. I might be off base, but you have another principle. You have a principle of disturbing somebody's Shabbos. You have the story with the talus, wait till after Shabbos. So maybe that was also part of his thinking.
Possible, but I don't believe if something, and we're going to get much more into the laws of when you have to tell someone and stop someone from doing something wrong. But I don't believe that a simple concern for not ruining someone's day or not, making them upset would necessarily be enough to not advise them that they're doing something wrong.
And the cow's already out there. Nothing.
Now, Dr. Hammer, I was thinking of something else that while you're talking about the gender and the dynamics, right, and this poor woman, maybe she doesn't have a man in the house, and maybe she's more vulnerable. On the flip side, if she's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's neighbor, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is this very, very fantastically wealthy person, it's at least plausible to assume that she may have been in a similar economic situation, right? You don't get to be the neighbor. If you're living in Herzliya Pituach in some villa on the water, right, probably your neighbor is not a second away from being homeless.
If you're on Hallandale Beach,
or if you're in Golden Beach, if you're living on Golden Beach and you have a neighbor, even if it's a smaller house and maybe even there isn't an ocean view, the person is probably not like a date.
So let me give it another twist, Rabbi. We're talking about a Talmud Chacham at the least. Okay.
Yeah, tzaddik.
And let's say the majority of people living in that neighborhood were well educated, right? Okay. And knew what a Gemara is and knew what is it not true that their wives or females in their families were not nearly as well educated and therefore might not have any idea of some of the intricacies of some of these laws, and therefore it's like you say, oh, no big deal to just tell you doing the wrong thing. But in order to do that, you would have to spend a lot of time trying to, it's not dictating you're doing the wrong thing, explaining to her what you're doing the wrong thing. And that might take a couple of weeks if she really has no background. And so that's also something
interesting. I mean, there is a discussion, again, not to fully answer your question, because I think in general, it sounds like many women were less educated and many men were uneducated in those days.
Right.
So on one hand, they were probably more used to taking piskei dinim as opposed to scholarship. Right. So it wouldn't be unheard if a person is uneducated to know that there's do's and don'ts. And if your neighbor, the chief of the Sanhedrin or one of the chiefs, right, tell you don't do that, you could pretty well assume that that's not an acceptable practice. On one hand, scholarship might not have to do with it. On the flip side, there is such a thing. There's a discussion about a chaver, and we've discussed this before, where there were people in time of the Beis Hamikdash and afterwards who were confirmed as reliably, I'm going to use this word, although it's not quite the same, reliably dependent. You can trust, they're kashrus, you can trust that they're going to do the tithes, you can trust the laws of purity and impurity. And there is a discussion, and typically, again, it's a discussion, but a woman could become and be presumed a chaver as well. Eshes chaver, the wife of a chaver, we're going to presume that she's also doing things appropriately. But that's another interesting thing to consider.
Does that carry on to modern day with asking a shaila of a rebbitzin?
That's a good question. By the
way, I'm not joking.
I know that.
My sister was a rebbitzin, and often people would come and my brother-in-law was not around, and they'd ask a pretty basic thing, and she was quite knowledgeable, and she would explain it to them, and so we would joke around, and some.
There's some shilas more appropriate.
We lost you, Doctor. You got muted again. We lost you.
Some shilas are more appropriate for the rebbitzin.
That's also true.
Right. Okay. No.
Indeed. Certainly, if a rebbitzin is in an environment where shilas are being asked, and it's
Right.
an elementary shilah, there's a possibility that she would know the halachic protocol.
The story in the Tosefta is ended somewhat abruptly. That is, it says that the cow was his neighbor's, and then it really stops telling the story, just saying that, and because of this, the cow was called is his name. Who
Right.
were there? Those who called the cow, the neighbors, the chachamim, and what kind of if he had to tell this woman that this behavior is not appropriate, what about others, those who called this cow by his name, why they didn't interfere or somehow played a role in this history? That is, the story in the Tosefta ends without telling the story. It starts telling the story and then ends. And I wonder what kind of this story, what is the role of this story in the Talmud? What does it teach us, and why it was included? That is, it's the Tosefta, not the text of the Talmud.
You're asking an interesting question. I just want to show you the person that calls this cow Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow, not the person, but the text is the Mishnah. So it starts with the Mishnah. The Mishnah, actually, I just scrolled up so you can see. Paratosho Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow, Haisa Yaitza B'Ritzua. It would go out on Shabbos. Shaloi B'Ritzon Chachamim, and it was not in accordance to the Chachamim's opinion. So the easy, literal reading of this text is that there was a disagreement between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and the Chachamim about the permissibility of a cow to have a strap on its horns. The Chachamim say it is not allowed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says it is allowed. And the Chachamim were not pleased that he was going against their majority rule. And this brings up all different kinds of traumas because we're very familiar with the story. I mean, I don't know, we've discussed where we've teased the famous story of the oven, right? And the debate about its purity, which leads to the excommunication of Lezer ben Horkinus. And so to have a rabbi outright disagree in practice with his colleagues is a problem. To disagree is not a problem, but to practice and to flout, to flaunt his own opinion against them sounds very problematic. So just to answer your question, who called it Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow? I don't know if the neighbors called it. The rabbis, after hearing the story, when they presented it, they made it as if it was he himself who did it. And they were coming to teach us a lesson. And the lesson is that, well, we'll see, the Gemara is going to say the lesson. But the lesson that they wanted to teach us is the lesson the Gemara is about to teach us. So let's see what the Gemara wants to infer from here. So again, the Gemara quotes, well, now I got to find our place again. So the Gemara asked the question, who owned the cow? And then the Gemara quoted the Tosefta, which actually presents the story in a different way. It wasn't really his, but the Chachamim kind of accused, or he's being punished in a sense, by being associated with this practice because he didn't protest. Because he didn't protest, therefore he was discredited. It's a dismerit in his file, and it's in the Mishnah, and that was because of his failure to protest. But in truth, he disagreed with Chacham. But he would not have gone against them, but he didn't feel so strongly. This is my interpretation based on reading the Ben Yehuda's interpretation. He didn't feel so strongly and passionately about it that he was willing to get into an awkward feud with his neighbor. Especially Dr. Hammer is describing this poor, vulnerable woman who would have been intimidated on a good day, and to have the neighbor come out and start screaming at him would have really ruined her day. And it was a Shabbos. And so he said, you know what, it's not all that bad. I myself don't think it's a problem. I wouldn't do it, but let's go easy on the neighbors. And the Chacham said, no. If you're not going to protest, then you're complicit. Silence is violence. That's what the Chachamim are saying here in this Mishnah. And we've already, not quite violence, but if you're going to be a bystander and you see something happen and you have the opportunity to jump in and you don't, you're partly to blame for that event. Now, I do want to share with you a nice story. It's a little bit, I don't think I shared it with you, but this Friday I got a call, or Thursday, from a member of the shul. Friday it was. A little shaken up. Actually, he texted me, please call me Rabbi. And so I called him, and he had been driving down US 1, right? And he's driving past the hospital, and he pulls in, he's trying to do a shortcut, so he pulls into the parking lot, or he had to stop by, where the Target and there's a Chabad there on right next to behind the gas station or near the gas station, and he pulls in and he sees a very horrific sight. He sees a young person with a knife attempting to take their life, and many people were driving past and no one was doing anything. And he saw this, and he immediately, until he could get to the person, he started honking the horn to distract the person, and they ran over and got the person to stop long enough for him to call 911. And he saved this person's life. Happened on Friday. And so many people drive by a scene and they don't intervene. And the person that has the moral clarity and fortitude to do something that's uncomfortable, to get involved in a messy situation, but he saved the person's life. And so it happened. And I salute him. I salute this young man for having the courage. And again, it was not without risk. The person who wanted to take their life was holding a knife, and he could have, God forbid, but this person, he saved the person's life. So anyways, that's a fresh story that happened this Friday. We should know of such events, and it's just terribly painful just to think that someone is in so much pain that they were willing to do that. But anyways, the good news is that his life was saved. All right, let's continue the Gemara. On the subject, Rav, V'Rabbi Chanina, V'Rabbi Yochanan, V'Rav Chaviva Masnu. We once had a teaching of the following rabbis that were conversing. And then the Gemara does something interesting. The Gemara gives us a note, a general note for the Talmud. Chulu de Seder Moed, whenever you read in the order of Moed, which means whenever you read the book of the Talmud, that's all the holiday-related Mesechtas, Passover, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, all the tractates in the Seder of Moed. Kichol HaIzuga, whenever you read about these rabbis being together, you got to know that you got to change one of the names. Chalufi Rabbi Yochanan, Uma'ayil Rabbi Yonasan. You need to mentally edit when you see Rabbi Yochanan and change it to Rabbi Yonasan. And by the way, it's not implausible to see how Yochanan and Yonatan might be mixed up. It's the only different letter is the Taf and the Ches, and it's not implausible. Why would you make such an amendment? So Rabbi Steinsaltz, the Steinsaltz Gemara immediately points out something that you're probably thinking already, which is that it would be very hard for all of these rabbis to be in the same sitting, because Rabbi Yochanan was considerably younger than Rav. And it's more plausible that the older Rabbi Yonatan would have been present. And that's indeed the editor's note provided here in the Gemara. Let me just see if we have here. The Gemara offers this amendation because of a chronological problem. Rabbi Yochanan was much younger than Rav, and there was an even greater distance between him and Rav Chanina. It's hard to imagine them sitting together. It would be like saying that, I'll tell you, it would be like saying, I don't want to say lahavdil, but if I were to tell you, I was sitting together with the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Feinstein and whatever, that would be the greatest privilege. But happens to be that I was born after Rabbi Feinstein passed away, and I was only a child when I had the privilege to see the Rebbe. So that would be a very hard to imagine kind of scenario. And so that's exactly what we're saying over here. Based on our knowledge of when they lived, the note says that we should insert Rabbi Yonasan.
Rabbi, I don't see the problem. It says they taught the same thing.
No. In this context, we're talking about that they were teaching together. They were schmoozing.
Where do you learn this from?
Because I know how the Gemara phrases itself, and it would either say Amar Rabbi Yechanina, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. It would say each one was quoting. Here it puts them all three in the same setting, and collectively they taught, the four of them. And so because it structures it that way, it's being presented as if they were sitting together and they shared the following teaching. And factually, this would be very hard to arrange, says Rabbi Steinsaltz, and it rings true, because we know Rav was the transitional era from the Mishnah to the Talmud, and probably Rabbi Chanina was even older than Rav, and therefore, whatever Rabbi Steinsaltz says rings true.
Maybe it's better to know less, because even from Rabbi Steinsaltz, I don't see the problem from reading it directly.
I don't understand. The Gemara itself is making this note. So the Gemara has good authority to make such a note about the chronology and the events that followed. Rabbi Steinsaltz is explaining to us why this mistake may have risen and why it's so clear that this is the correction. It's based on the ages and the era they lived. Right? But the bottom line is, here is the teaching that we have from them. Ready for this?
Yeah.
A person that has the ability to protest, to correct the behavior of one of the people of their households, but does not do so, he could be punished, literally apprehended for the behavior of his household. Rashi nitzvas, a person has the capacity to speak up and doesn't. Well, they are partially culpable for those misdeeds. Now you're going to say, what if? And here's the fact. I'll tell you this as a rabbi. Many times people will come to me and say, I have a relative and I would love for them to get involved in Yiddishkeit. I became a Baal Teshuvah, and it would really be meaningful if my uncle would have a chance to appreciate what I've gone through and done. So you'll turn to that person and say, hey, it's your uncle. Why don't you go talk to your uncle? Oh, I can't talk to my uncle. I can't talk like that. And this is not wrong. This is true. And I'll tell you something else. Sometimes we're working on fundraising projects, and people in the shul, they want to help raise money for the shul. And so they're going through lists, and they're going to call their friends and ask if they want to get on board, especially the friends that have asked them to be on board in other tzedakahs. And then I say, what about your family? Don't you have a cousin who Fortune 500, you want to ask him? No, he's family. I can't ask him. So what's my point? It's hard, legitimately hard, and sometimes impossible to have certain kind of delicate conversations with our family. And I don't believe that's what the Gemara will clarify specifically. But that's not what we're talking about here. But if a person, man of the house, and the dynamics are such where the family will take your opinion seriously, or maybe even if you're not sure, well then, the Gemara is saying that you should speak up. But if the people of your town are acting up, so my asterisk was just to acknowledge that there are times that it is legitimately hard or seemingly impossible to have certain kind of conversations. But anyways, if people in your town are messing up and you don't speak out, one could be culpable and punished for the misdeeds of the people of the town. For example, if we think back, the Gemara is going to bring its own examples. If we think about the different medrashim and the way we understand the story of the golden calf, we believe most of the Jewish people weren't actively involved. And there were varying degrees of involvement. But some of the culpability was for the lack of speaking up. And if there are sins in the whole world, in your region, and you have influence, how do you have influence? So Rashi says, if you are a king or a prince, that you have a lot of influence, he has the ability to speak up, Mekayim Dvar, people respect him and will listen to his words. Nitvas al kol ha'olam kulai, then he could be culpable for the people under his influence that he does not speak up against. So to paraphrase, people that are under your influence who are doing misdeeds and you don't speak up, one could be partially culpable because you have the ability to speak up. That's essentially what this teaching says.
So, Rabbi Lahavdil, the non-Jews have a Good Samaritan ruling,
Okay.
but it goes even further. There are certain countries where by law, if you don't stop to help, you could be prosecuted.
Hold on. I'm sorry. Again, the Good Samaritan law says you're allowed to get involved and you won't be culpable if something doesn't work out entirely. But you're saying there are other countries, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Where
France is one.
Where if you see something and you don't act up, you could be culpable for not helping out.
Exactly.
And so here, this is, of course, more of a spiritual culpability. I think that's the point that we should make clear. We're talking about a spiritual culpability to Hashem for not speaking up.
No, apropos the story you told.
Right. And today, there's a whole nother kind of influence that we have. Today, with social media, we have, I would say, apparent, perceived influence, right? You have influencers. You have 1 million people that listen to your every word on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And so I don't think the influence that one wields over their followers is quite the influence of a melech, a nasi, a father, or a person that's respected in town. But I would say that we could probably extend, especially we're talking about ethical issues like standing up for Eretz Yisrael when they're being attacked by rockets and the like. I think we could say that a person that has influence should use their influence to try to set people straight and to do positive. And if someone is doing something wrong, there might be a way to speak up. And so there you have it. So this is a similar teaching on the subject of toichecha, of admonishment and protest, that if you have influence, you should use your influence. Yes, doctor, go ahead.
I apologize. I had to go away for 2 minutes.
No worries.
So the question is, how does this relate to privilege regarding rabbis, mental health professionals, lawyers, etc.?
If you don't mind, just specify what you mean.
Somebody tells, well, I'm not going to deal with psychology because there are laws. Someone tells a rabbi, I intend to do harm to this other person.
So you're a mandated reporter or whatever the exact phrase is in. So yeah, a person certainly must use whatever influence and opportunity available to prevent sin or harm. Here, I believe, just to clarify further, I believe what we're talking about is bein adam lamakom, even between man and God. So there aren't going to be human victims.
Okay.
Even then, there's a spiritual culpability. Certainly, if you have a knowledge, if someone comes to you as a rabbi and says, "I'm thinking of, God forbid, harming someone else or myself," and again, there's different laws with rabbis and physicians and people in education.
Right.
But generally speaking, we're certainly morally required to intervene to prevent the person from harming themselves and harming others. Where it gets more complicated is that sometimes people are poetic about describing their angst and frustration. They don't literally mean that they're going to carry out the harm. And that's, I guess, where probably it's part of training if you're in the mental health profession or in other space, and you have to use common sense. But certainly we got to err on the side of saving lives. But here I believe we're talking about spiritual matters. And that's probably where a rabbi has an easier time than a person in the mental health space. And I'll tell you why. Because a rabbi, typically, the perspective that people are coming to is from the perspective of Jewish morality. And so therefore, a rabbi is not going to be disappointing their client or their constituent or their congregant if they say, hey, you want to know my opinion? The Torah says this item between you and God is not a good idea. But if you're in the mental health space, it gets a lot more delicate. I just want to acknowledge that because you have to factor in the person's, well, the rabbi also has to, of course, consider a person's mental health and general circumstance, but it certainly is probably more complicated in the rabbi, where a person typically is coming to them for a moral or spiritual guidance. Reb Beryl, yes, go ahead.
Bernie, I know you want us to feel sorry for the psychologists, etc., but the profession with the big problem are the lawyers
Right.
in these cases.
A lawyer is even more complicated. Yes, that's true. And Dr. Hammer brought that up. He mentioned mental health. Doctor, you're muted again. But he actually brought up rabbis, mental health people, and lawyers. And lawyers, you're right, that's a complicating. Although I will say, I think typically lawyers are consulted after the fact. So they don't necessarily have the opportunity to protest. They're just there to see if they're going to help the person, manage their culpability.
They're the pathologists.
All right, let's take a look. Let's see. Oh, I just want to read for you. This is interesting. A nice summary by the Meiri, and let's see if he has any takes on this that we haven't perceived until now. And then we'll go on the Gemara. He presents this as a summary of the Gemara. He says these are areas where a person must be careful. Not only must the person be mindful not to commit an avera or a breach of Jewish practice. He must also protest when he is able. This is again informed by later on in the Gemara. When a person has the capacity or the opportunity to protest and he doesn't, this is the line I wanted to show. It's as if he had done so. And this is what our Gemara means. When it says the person that has the ability to influence their household and doesn't do so, he can be punished. His city and doesn't do so, punished. Or if you have worldwide influence, Instagram, Twitter, social media, a king, different situations, you have to use that influence. Now let's see the rest of the Gemara. Amar Papa, you're going to like this. Oh, no, we're going to do this line. The next line you're really going to appreciate. For example, members of the Reish Galusa, this is, again, we've described the leading, I don't know if it was a king or the political leader of the Jewish autonomous community in Bavel. They are culpable for the entire Jewish world because once upon a time, the seat of Jewish leadership, spiritual and political, in Bavel extended to the whole world. And then at certain times that influence shrunk. In the days of Rav Papa, apparently it was worldwide. Rav Chanina said, what is the meaning of the verse? Hashem b'mishpat yavai. Hashem in judgment will come. Hashem will judge the elders and its chiefs. What does that mean? Maybe the princes sinned as described earlier. So let's see, Rabbi Steinsaltz gives us the earlier psukim in Yeshaya. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes. What is he going to say? It is you who have eaten up the vineyard. The robbery of the poor is in your house. So this is really describing the practice of the princes. The princes sinned. What did the elders do? They're too frail to be breaking into people's vineyards. Why were the elders punished? We're talking about elders who refrained from protesting. And Rashi says this is the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin were righteous people, but they didn't speak up when crime was being committed, and they are therefore being punished by Hashem. Again, by Hashem for this crime. I will point out, theft is bein adam lechavero, between man and his fellow man. Mm-hmm. So again, continuing on the subject of protest and the moral and halachic responsibility of speaking up when you have the capacity of being taken seriously by the people who you speak up to.
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi Beryl.
Are we just being told this as a lesson, or do we know historically that such events really happened where they blamed the whole Sanhedrin?
Well, we're reading the book of Yeshaya, Isaiah, where Hashem is explicitly saying that he's going to punish the elders for not protesting. So that is an instance where the Gemara is trying to give us some evidence from the Tanakh. There'll be some more stories that we'll see shortly that also make the same point. Be'ezer Hashem. So you want to know in more modern history? I don't know. But the point is, well, let's see, another story. This is a little bit of a count. This is going to make a little bit of the counterpoint. Rabbi Yehuda, well, it makes our point and a counterpoint. Rabbi Yehuda have a Yosef Kamei de Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda was sitting in the base medrash, let's say, of Shmuel. Asoi hahi itza, a lady came inside, a woman came inside. Katzavcha Kamei, and was screaming. What was she screaming about? Something that was done wrong in court. She was, or something was done wrong to her. Steinfeld says an injustice committed against her. V'loy have a mashkach ba, and he didn't really take that seriously. He didn't pay attention. He didn't acknowledge the complaint. Amar Leis, Rabbi Yehuda tells Shmuel, don't you know there's a pasuk that says, Oitim Oznoi, a person who stops their ears, mizakas dal, from the cry of the poor, gamhu yikra v'lo yana, Hashem won't answer him when he calls out. Don't you realize how important it is when a vulnerable person is crying out and they're not being helped? You need to intervene. Amar Lei, Shmuel responds, Shinada. This is a complimentary term saying wise, not smart aleck, but, or why, he's saying wise guy, but not in a cynical way. He's saying, you are a wise person, but you should know as follows. Reishach Bikariri, your chief, your teacher, me, I'm going to be punished with some cold water. It's not going to hurt me that much. Reishach the Reishach, my chief, Bichamimi, don't go to me, talk to my manager. The head of the court, he is the one that's ultimately liable. Hayaseh Mar Ukva Bezdin, because Mar Ukva is the head of the Bezdin, and he is the one that's going to be responsible if injustice is done. So he wasn't passing the buck. What I believe this story is telling us is he was saying, I don't have the capacity to intervene because it's above my pay grade. And so the real individual that's culpable is the one that has the influence, which I believe is making the point that although you have to speak up, if you don't have influence, if you don't have the ability, well then, what can you do? Rashi. Ani, Shani Rabba, me, I'm your teacher, your chief, your Rosh. Eini Nichva, I'm not going to be scalded. I'm not going to be punished for this. Aber Mar Ukva, my boss, Shehurash Li, he's the head of the Sanhedrin. Vilach and you, Av Bezin, Yechava B'chamin. If this is truly an injustice, he's going to be scorched in punishment for not sufficiently taking this matter seriously. A very interesting story. A lot needs to be. There's a lot that I don't fully grasp over here. Namely, why isn't Mar Ukva intervening? Are we alleging rabbinic malpractice? Or was he simply saying that I can't intervene, so I'm not culpable? Mar Ukva is going to intervene. Should he not intervene, then he would be in trouble. So that's a way to read it, to not say that the lady's literally being left vulnerable and unheard, simply that he's not the one that ultimately is liable in the event that she's not heard. Yes, Rebero.
There's something else going on here. Who says that she really is suffering an injustice? If he would take up her case, he's automatically saying that they ruled improperly.
Well, I just want to clarify something because I had the same question. It's not, she isn't necessarily saying that there was an unfair ruling. It sounds like she's saying there's an issue that needs to be taken up by the court. But it doesn't say that she was found to be not.
Well, how else would you interpret injustice? I mean, I'm looking.
She came into the Beis Din and said, Rebbe, help me out. Someone is stealing my cow. They keep on taking the band off my cow's horns. Can you get it back for me? You better get it back for me. So it's like, what's the thing they say? I'm sorry, this is Wendy's. You're in the wrong place. If you go into McDonald's and you ask for a hammer, they'll tell you, I'm sorry, I feel for you, but you got to go to Home Depot. So he's essentially saying you came to the wrong place. This is not where you file your enlarge a complaint.
Right.
Maybe. Or maybe this wasn't quite a legal matter, but someone of standing needed to intervene and talk to her oppressor. Let's see briefly.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Offhand, do you know of instances in the Gemara where it talks about a man coming before a body of Sanhedrin or court or whatever and cries?
That would I mean, it's going to be sprinkled across the entirety of time. You're saying literally crying?
It says it cried before. Yeah.
Well, tzavcha means scream, not cry. But I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think I know where you're getting at. I don't know.
The same thing that with the women's thing. Yeah.
I don't know if there is an explicit reference. I suspect there is.
It's I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I'm just referring to the issue of the emotionality that's been alleged for women with edus and other issues, whether real or whatever. And the question is, do you respond to the woman because she's not, unlike men, she can't really make the argument?
That is certainly discussed. How you would help a plaintiff if they aren't. The Sanhedrin was tasked with teasing out and clarifying the situation, and so even if a person was less educated, that they shouldn't be disadvantaged in court.
Right.
And like, so I just want to show you this really briefly. The Ben Yehoyada points out something very interesting, because essentially you have three levels of authority. You have Rabbi Yehuda, who is the junior rabbi in this scenario. You have Shmuel, who is the middle, right? He's on top right, and then you have Mar Ukva. There's a story in the Gemara in Baba Basra. Let's look it up instead of. Just give me a moment. There's a very interesting story in the Gemara, and I want to show it to you. Just give me a moment. Here's the story. I'll show you in English. Yosef, son of Rabbi Yeshua, became ill and fainted. The literal words in the Gemara indicate that he died, or he went into a coma, or he had a near-death experience. And when he was healed, his father said, "What did you see?" And he said, "I saw an olam hafach re'isi, an inverted world. Those that were considered high and chashav, prestigious, in this world were lower, and those who were lower were considered higher." Yeshua told his son, "Olam bara re'isa." What you saw was actually the truth. Our world is the false world, and what you saw is the true world. Tosfos says that we have a tradition from the Gaonim, teacher to student. What was this vision that he saw? He saw Shmuel interacting with his student. And he saw that the dynamics, although Shmuel was the junior, Rabbi Yehuda was the junior, it sounds like he's saying that in truth, Rabbi Yehuda, for speaking up, was afforded greater prestige than the one who was silent, if I understand correctly. And so that's a very interesting connection. In other words, that Tosfos, if I understand correctly, and I surveilled it briefly, it sounds like we're not actually entirely thrilled with the silence here. He had an excuse. He wasn't the ultimate authority, but it seems like ultimately Rabbi Yehuda is given a higher prestige in that world than Shmuel. So you have the junior guy who's willing to talk up to his senior, but you have the middle guy who's not willing to talk up to his senior chief, And ultimately, Rabbi Yehuda, the junior, is afforded more kavod in that world for his willingness to speak up in the face of injustice. And if that's the case, ultimately, we see that it is preferred to speak up. That's a very interesting detail to add to the conversation here. All right, make of it as you wish. But I find that very. Oh, you see, all the commentaries actually refers to this Gemara Baba Basra. Tosfos that actually quotes this story. All right, we have a few more minutes. Shmuel says, you know why Mar Ukva is going to be in trouble? Because the verse says, Beis David Koyem Mar Hashem. In Yirmiyahu, the house of David, this is what Hashem says. Dinoi laboiker mishpat. He's going to be judged in the morning. Vatzilu gozo mi'aloishek. Deliver the person that's being robbed by an oppressor. Execute judgment in the morning. Deliver him that is being treated unjustly. If not, my fury will go forth like fire and burn, so none can quench it because of your evil doing. In other words, those that are tasked with justice must do their job. If not, Hashem will be angry, like fire, burn. And so Shmuel is saying, Mar Ukva, who's tasked to oversee judgment, and particularly Mar Ukva, who was a descendant of Beis David, he was a descendant of the family line of David HaMelech, he will be punished for not standing up for those being treated unjustly. Similarly, Rav Zera said to, or actually no, this is the counterpoint I was really referencing, although it's similar to Shmuel. Rav Zera says to Rabbi Shimon, why don't you speak truth to power? Why don't you speak up to the Reish Gelusa, to the exilarch? They're doing things incorrectly and you know it. If I'll speak up, they won't listen to me anyways. Amarle, he says, teacher, even though they might not accept what you have to say, you should still talk truth to power. You should still speak up and say that which needs to be said. So basically, we have this tension between, is it worth speaking up if you know your voice won't be heard? And there's a case to be made that you shouldn't, but there's a strong case to be made that you should. Or Tosfos says, you can't be 1,000,000% certain that you won't be listened to. Then you should still speak up. If you're certain that they're not going to listen to you, then the Gemara says that it is actually better for the person to be a shogeg than amazing. So let's say you see somebody doing something wrong. Should you speak up to them? Well, if you know they'll value your words, absolutely you should. If you're not certain, well, Rab Zera is saying, you should still speak up because they might listen to you. But if you're absolutely certain the person's not going to listen to you, then better not to speak up. There may also be a distinction between a private setting and a public setting. Sometimes in public, if someone's doing something wrong, even if they're not going to listen to you, you still have a moral responsibility to speak up, lest others come to be convinced that it is acceptable. So all told, let us say as follows. It's quite complicated. The nuanced scenarios and circumstances of when one should and shouldn't speak up. But generally speaking, this Gemara is telling us you should still err on the side of letting your voice be heard. Reb Errol?
Why didn't we use this excuse with the cow? That maybe he felt the woman wouldn't listen to him anyway?
Because why shouldn't she listen to him? And probably if you really didn't think she listened to him, then maybe they wouldn't hold it against him. But if you're the neighbor of the great Elazar ben Azariah, says, hey, maybe take the headband. I know you worked really hard to put that headband on your cow, but maybe take it off till after Shabbos. Rebero, you asked for another anecdote. Let's take a look. Rav Acha, son of Rav Chanina, said as follows. Hashem, when he says something bad in prophecy, it can be reversed. When Hashem says or promises something good, that is never reversed, with one exception. Chutz midavar zeh, with the following exception. Ichsiv. So here we have in Yecheskel. Vayomer Hashem Elov, Hashem told him, and I believe this is talking about an angel. Avor b'toich ha'ir, circulate throughout the city, b'toich Yerushalayim, within Yerushalayim. V'hisvisa tov al mitzchos ha'anoshim hanenochim v'hanenokim. Place the letter Tuf on their foreheads of the people that sigh and cry because of all of the bad stuff that's being done in their midst. Rashi, Elu tzadikim. These are the people that feel really terrible about the bad stuff. They're righteous. Amar le Kadosh Baruch le Gabriel. Here is the Gemara's interpretation. Hashem was speaking to the angel Gabriel and said as follows. We're talking about the city of Yerushalayim, where there was a lot of sinning and problems. Of course, we're talking about the time that precedes the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Lech u'shoim al mitzchan shel tzadikim. Go draw on the foreheads of tzadikim. Tav. What is a tav? Anyone can guess what a tav is? It's the letter Tuf.
It's the last letter of the alphabet.
Last letter of the alphabet. Shel diyoy, in ink on their foreheads. Shelo yishlutu bahen malachei chabala. So the angels of destruction will avoid these tzadikim. V'al mitzcham shel rishayim, and on the forehead of the wicked people, tov shel dam. Make the same sign out of blood. Kidei sheyishlutu bahen malachei chabala, so that the destructive angels know their targets. Today, in modern warfare, I believe the technology is so that you can put you can put you could lock in the coordinates on a target, and so you know exactly more or less where your missile or rocket will be fired. And so in those days, they didn't have this technology, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu does, and he says, lock a target on the foreheads of those that need to be harmed, punished, and you can also put a special sign to keep safe those who need to be kept safe. This was the initial proposal. This, unfortunately, is overturned, and this is the teaching that nothing is overturned except for this. The attribute of judgment tells Hashem, why do some people get an ink Tuf and some people get a bloody Tuf? That sounds like a new drink, a cocktail of bloody Tuf.
A scarlet letter.
Yeah. Amar lo.
I'd rather have a mazel tov.
A mazel tov. I think we can make a whole line of kosher cocktails. All right. Halalu tzadikim gemurim, halalu rishayim gemurim. Hashem says they're the ones that have the ink are righteous. The one that have the blood are wicked. Amar lefanov. Hashem's attribute of justice says, Kaviyachol Rebbeinu Shalom, Master of the world, they're not so righteous. They should have spoken up. Amar Allah, Hashem responds and says, I know. It's clear to me. That if the righteous would speak up, the bad, wicked people would never accept their admonishment. Amar lefanov, but the Hashem's attribute of justice responds, you know that they will not respond. But how should they know? They don't know the future. And so even though ultimately Hashem knows that the evildoers would not have stopped, the righteous had no evidence, and therefore they're going to be punished. And this is the meaning of the verse. Zokein, Bachor Ubesula, elders, boys, girls, Taf, Vinashim, women and children, Tahargu Lamashchis, will be killed. Everybody with a Taf. And the punishment comes before the people, the elders. Rav Yosef says, read this differently, not Mikdashi el Mikudashai. Elu b'nei Yisrael shekimu es haTorah b'me'al Taf. This is the description even of righteous people who kept the Torah from Aleph till Tav. Miyad b'hini shisha nashim boy mederach shar ha'elyon asher mafna zefoina v'ish kli mipatzoi b'yada v'ish acha b'toichem lavush habadim v'kesem ha'sofer v'masna v'yivoy v'yamdu eitz al mizbeach ha'nechoshes. Tragically, 6 harmful, damaging damagers arrived to punish everybody. Mizbeach ha'nechoshes nihava. Was there a bronze mizbeach or a copper mizbeach? The troubles all broke out in the place where the Leviim would sing Shira with their copper instruments, and therefore the punishment begins in the Beis Hamikdash. Who are the 6 people? These are Malachi Chabola. These are angels of destruction called Ketzef, Af, Chema, Mashchis, Mishaber, Umechala. Ketzef means anger. Af means another kind of anger. Chema. 3 different expressions of Hashem's anger. Mashchis, destruction. Mishaber, breaking. Mechala, destroying. Again, 6 angels of destruction. And so unfortunately, even the people that were mostly righteous, they didn't protest and they were swept into this terrible moment. Tomorrow, we're going to talk all about the letter Tuf, its significance, and we're going to encounter some very well-known and famous Mamor Chazal. So let's just recap today's Gemara. Today's Gemara, all one theme: the importance of protesting when you have the ability to have your voice heard, and even possibly the necessity of speaking up if you're only possibly going to have your voice heard. And we saw it with examples from the Tanakh. We saw it from examples in the Beis Din of the Amaroyim. We have the story of Mar Ukva, Shmuel, and Yehuda, and we have the story of Zerah talking to his friend about the necessity of speaking up, even if it's possible you won't be heard. And of course, it's a reminder to us that when we have the opportunity to make a difference, we should be bold and not good politicians. And I have to close. I know we're a little bit over time. My mother, Allah Shalom, taught us there's different stuff, different people and that could do harmful and not good things. And there were times that a lot of the people in leadership were afraid to speak up. And she insisted herself to speak up, even though it's awkward and uncomfortable. And I'm not sure if she even got the person that she wanted to get fired from. It was a person that was potentially a molester, and they had a job dealing with children in a shul. And my mother was horrified, and she spoke out. And none of the rabbis wanted to get involved, but she made a lot of noise. And she said, "You're not allowed to be quiet. If children's well-being this is not in Hallandale, by the way, so don't worry. But this was somewhere else in the broader country, let's say." And she said, "You got to speak up. It's awkward, and the rabbis weren't comfortable, but you got to speak truth to power and make sure that evil is not done, harm does not come to innocent victims." Dear friends, thank you for joining us. Tomorrow we'll end on a more upbeat note, but this is an important subject. And thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful, blessed day. I'm going to end this link in just a moment, and you're welcome to join again to study Chumash. And by the way, all of these classes, Be'ezer Hashem, are being uploaded on YouTube on our Chabad Ocean page. And eventually we'll get it on the website too, so you can always watch the reruns, or if you miss a class. The last few weeks we've been getting better at getting it all online. So enjoy and thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Looking forward to a tough shear tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow will be tough.
But at least we know we're at the end.
Oh.